thank you very much, David. And we're on to the final session of our conference. This will be a discussion between panelists, but it's also an opportunity for you as members of the audience to raise questions. I've had a quick look at the chat. I mean, there's quite a lot of discussion about whether David should sing or not, but no questions I can see so far. Do please use the chat to feed questions in. The two members of the panel you know already, George and David, and we're joined by two others. So Charles Mbugua, who is a frontline social work practitioner with a long and extensive experience in several countries in Africa. He's a past president of the International Federation of Social Workers, Africa region, and a former co-chair of the Commonwealth Organization for Social Work. We're also pleased to be joined by Sharon-Rose Gittens, who is a qualified social worker and former registered nurse who joined the Barbados Welfare Department in 1999. She holds a master's degree in education psychology, involving dissertation on understanding the perpetrator of domestic violence using learning theories. Perhaps I could ask Charles and Sharon first to share some thoughts about the conference today and the themes of the conference.
Philip, I'm just checking, and Charles has been here for most of the day, but he isn't currently in the list of participants. So
okay, well maybe
he may have lost it. So Sharon needs to go first.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that, Philip. Thank everybody in terms of being here and sunny Barbados in the evening. I think the conference has been very, very rich. We have gone through quite a bit of interesting topics, from the resurgence of Ubuntu to discussions on marriage, also in terms of discussions as relates to legislation and just the whole journey of the histories of social work. And I honestly think that it has showed us the question of where we're going, having been so far started in all the other countries. It has really been quite impactful, I thought, and really make you think, even now in this COVID-19 period, what worked then, can we adopt some of those things as we speak? So it has been rich.
I see Charles is there, is calling himself Apple on the picture. So sorry, Philip.
Apple. I'm hoping you heard what I shared as well, David.
Yeah, we did. Thank you very much. Don't worry.
He was saying the big lost with the apple, but it's fine.
Charles, over to you for reflections.
Thank you. I think it has been a reflection. It is something that I'm sure, speaking on behalf of the others in the team, is something that we had all missed. It has been a real kind of harvesting, and we really have hand across the regions, and it's something that we really need to redo after some times. Yeah.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
George,
would you like that? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, in terms of, it sort of reinforced quite a bit when I look at the points made for social workers to think as a human rights practitioner as well, which was reinforced earlier today, and having that rights-based approach in what we do ties so closely into the Ubuntu. that asks us to, you know, unlock our talents, and the idea of their values also fitted in quite well. So I just wanted to highlight that too.
Thank you very much indeed. George, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, very briefly, I think it was 2 days of really rich engagement and reflections and deep understanding of the history of social work. And I was really pleased to hear and learn more about the history of social work and some of the current imperatives and challenges, both in the African as well as in the Afro-Caribbean context.
Yeah.
And that was really a rich learning for me as well. And one thing my take-home message from these 2 days of conference is that no matter where we are and what kind of wider socio-cultural and economic context that we find ourselves in, social work is driven by one common shared identity or shared value, and that is to be there for others in times of need. And that sense of Ubuntu, that, you know, I am because we are, and it's really important for us to remember when much of the Western world social work is driven by managerialism and neoliberal ideas, where our approach to social work is informed by the need for an outcome-based approach. And we tend to see people as numbers, and therefore reflecting back to some of these notions of who we are, and that philosophical understanding of Ubuntu will help us to keep people, service users, communities and families at the center of our practice, to re-engage with people who we work with, rather than losing touch with the reality that social work is there to support people in need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David, would you like to say some preliminary thoughts?
I see there are some specific questions coming up in the, chat, so it would be good to go to them. But I think, I mean, one of the reasons why managerialism developed in many countries, and why the whole package developed, was because people looked at public services and they said, are they really serving the public? How do we know that we're getting money, we're paying our taxes, and how do we know these public services are giving value? And that was a real challenge. And I think it's been a challenge for us because it's a legitimate question. It has to be answered. But the way it has been answered has created some of the problems that we have seen. So that we can't ignore that question. How do we show the public that what we are doing is for the public good, is not just to pay our salaries, that it is something that is for the public good. So that has, whether we're talking about Ubuntu or whether we're talking about Western systems, or the many different philosophical approaches, the Gandhian approaches, public servants have to show the public that they are servants and that they are providing a good, something good. So somehow we have to grapple with that. That's one thing. And the other one is we communicate as people through words. So if we, and internationally, we've shaped statements about what we are about, what our ethics are, what our definition is. And if they're wrong, and they may be, we have to find other words to use to describe it. And what should those words be on the basis of history and on the basis of thinking forward? And that's where the rich value of these sorts of events is, that we can share those words and debate them and critically analyze them, Philip.
Yeah, no, I'll feed in some of those questions. I see there's quite a technical question come in, which I'll throw out to the panel in a minute. But I just wanted to pick up on your point, David, about managerialism, because I was thinking about that as well when George was speaking, and surely it's almost an inevitable part of us all, to an extent, living in the spotlight and under media attention. We all know that when there's a particularly terrible case, say a child is murdered, and one tracks back, and it turns out that there were warnings that weren't acted upon, and there was a scandal. And so it's almost inevitable that systems should be put in place which are ever more demanding in terms of recording what has happened, making sure that there are structures for reporting upwards and sideways and downwards. Is there any way out of that kind of managerialism,
Well,
do you think?
I think there is, and I did do some research back in 2000 for the Audit Commission, and it was published by the British government, so they endorsed it at the time, and that said very clearly that where the organisations that could demonstrate they were providing the best services were those that actually were blending their managerial values and the values they expected of the staff, that they aren't different. Actually, it is about how you serve people, and that there is evidence that shows, and interestingly, I was listening to the radio today, this week in the UK, there was a program on kindness, and it said that people think that to be a strong boss, you need to be assertive, aggressive, and if you want people to like you, you've got something wrong with you. But actually, all the research, and this I drew on this research for my report, all the research says that when people apply humanitarian values to their relationships, including work, including as a boss, you are more likely to get good outcomes. And actually, they've done research of several hundred bosses, and the chances of being good, having good outcomes, if you are an aggressive, assertive, and unpleasant boss, is 1 in 2,000. It's hardly likely. The people who get the best results are the people who apply humanitarian values. And that is consistent with social work, and is consistent, I think, with Ubuntu and with all these other philosophies, that if we apply these things that we know about human relationships, we get better results. But how we put that over is the challenge for us.
Right. Sharon-Rose and Charles, would you like to comment on this issue about managerialism within, you know, the context of your own experiences?
Okay, go Charles.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
You go. Yeah, Charles.
Well, the managerial values normally are grounded or based on policies, and behind those policies, the historical development of those policies and the people who drive that policy is also an issue that also need to be understood. In the African context, if you look at most of the former British colonies, the policies and the way that the setup was in terms of who gets education, who gets employed, and where the divide of who did what in those pre-colonial years, still those remnants, we still have them. So the policies which are normally based on the development plans, or which drive the plans and which put people on those positions, still there are some questions, and there are some loopholes. You see of, for example, of policies on health, on education, on and agriculture, and the managers, the shortcoming, the managerial values, the shortcomings are not blamed at times on the drivers of the policies. And normally they hide under they are hidden under the policies. If you look at the management of health institutions or education or agriculture, you expect, particularly in some areas, you see areas like issues like food insufficiency, education, the basis on which that was founded, particularly when there was the divide during the colonial period. If those issues were not sorted out, it means the drivers of the policies were a certain group and leaving the other group behind. And ever since going forward, that group will always remain behind, agitating other issues. So as much as we look at the values, there is much more that need to be looked into, and that's why the digging or looking back into the historical development and foundations of the management of public affairs is important, and I think is part of what this forum is set to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Sharon-Rose, would you like to come in?
And following on from Charles, in terms of looking at, yes, there are loopholes. And as George spoke about this humanistic approach, I think right now we have been able, and over the years we've shown, we've been able to train and produce professional social workers, but at the same time, what has become a challenge is where you're looking now at the employee. So as one of the presenters shared, you have a number of unemployed graduates and asking for a revitalization, a change in curriculum, which also embraces social entrepreneurship, business, and management, which means you have a social worker, yes, we're trained in social work, but coming into a workplace, then you have definitely some disconnect. And in some cases, we really need to better prepare our social worker to understand the values of the workplace and how to perform. So you're skilled, yes, you're trained, yes, you know what it is to be a social worker and care for and empower other persons, but then the work environment somewhat changes that social worker. So from our end, I think that is something that we need to explore some more when we have chance to. But the room is there in terms of building social work in leadership positions.
Thank you very much indeed. There's a question from Richard Ramsey, and see who would like to tackle this one. Richard says, could the panel speak on the influence of Western science, so pre-20th century, on developments in Commonwealth countries and advancements in the 20th century with quantum science, the undivided and divided worlds of David Bohm, David Peat, and recent discussions of Western science catching up with indigenous knowledge and science? Anyone like to have a go at that? George, do you want to come in?
I wonder if Richard, I see Richard is there, whether he wants to elaborate a little bit on the question.
I was wanting to say something to the previous question about
well, you go first on that, George,
but
and then we'll
I'm not I'm not well placed to respond to Richard Ramsey's really interesting question.
Okay, yeah.
But I can just add to what we were talking about managerialism by reflecting on my own experience as a social worker over the last maybe 20, 25 years. Having come to this country end of last 1990s, I became a social worker in one of the largest social work councils in Scotland, the Glasgow City Council. And it was a really fascinating experience for me, where I, as a social worker, had a lot of autonomy and freedom to carry out an assessment, come up with a package of care, and just say to my manager, this is what I need, I would get it. Okay, and that clearly shows that. And secondly, I had the time to spend time, I had the opportunity and freedom and flexibility to spend time with my service user. And things have moved on. And when I started to work as a social worker, there was a lot of emphasis on that notion of person-centered practice, not only the emphasis, actual practice of it. I could go and have a cup of tea with the service user, and have a chat with them. It was more of me providing a service to them as much as I was learning so many things from them, having come from a different cultural context. And they were telling me all about the war and how the war impacted on them, the poll tax and whatnot. Okay, so it was really an opportunity to build relationship. And over the last 22 years, what I hear and gather from some of my practice colleagues is that, well, people will be asked to carry out an assessment and come up with a package of care, but it has to go through a series of decision-making bodies, almost to the office of the director of social work before they can get the services approved. And that clearly shows how much bureaucracy and managerialism has creeped into because of the changes that over the last number of years have happened in the Scottish/UK context. Few weeks ago, literally about 3 weeks ago, I was in Kampala, Uganda, and I went to meet some of my, research collaborations and whatnot. And I was at one of the agencies working with refugees. And it was a breath of fresh air to see how services are arranged just like that, and that clearly shows what are some of the things that we can bring back to reconnect with people. And I think we have already talked about how social work, both education and practice, has evolved over time in the Western context compared to what is happening perhaps in the global South, where in the Western context, the social work education and policies are driven closely by some of the policies and frameworks of the state, and where there is, you have practice with children and families or adults or criminal justice and whatnot, while in the global South, there is much more flexibility to engage or engage with all these issues, but also bigger challenges of climate change, disaster management, forced migration, and also maybe take into social action. And I can't see any social workers organizing a social action movement in this part of the world. Okay, we do have, but that's not by social workers. And that's what I was thinking about, how we need to really learn lessons from each other to go back to really embrace that notion of the global definition of social workers and the meaning of Ubuntu.
Thank you very much indeed. Would any of the other panelists like to come back on that? Yeah, David.
I am interested to link that in with the questions from Richard and see how those connections are. You end up, Richard, by looking at finally Western science finally catching up with Indigenous knowledge, and in a way that's been part of a theme of these two webinars as well, of linking. I wondered if you wanted to develop what you see as happening in there and what you think it might relate, how that might relate to social work.
Yeah, Richard, do please unmute yourself, and if you'd like to come in and say a little bit more about
that. Yeah, well, thank you for that opportunity. It's been a deep interest of mine for many years, and part of it goes back to the time that I had a chair in social work at the Tata Institute in the mid-90s, and wanting to look at how the East and West science and philosophies fit together. And I became very familiar with David Boehm's physicist work and his world beliefs around the undivided whole, in which the world by and large is fragmented and assumed to be independent in space and time. And that's roughly the reductionist sort of science of the pre-20th century. And as we moved into the 20th century, and whether it's Einstein and quantum science and other things that have come along, social work doesn't seem to have addressed these developments from science and has attempted to move in the progress. You won't see very much about those kinds of subjects in a social work curriculum. And
Richard,
I'm curious.
Richard, can I ask you how specifically you think social work might respond to those ideas?
Well, I would think one of the things that is interesting is that social work has places a lot of emphasis on the individual from a Western science point of view, which I think is part of the clash with indigenous cultures and places that put more emphasis on the collective or a combination of the collective and the individual. We have a longstanding value belief in self-determination, and that has different kinds of meanings or definitions, but the literal definition of self-determination is I can do what I want, the freedom. And the obligation side is often stated but not practiced. And the argument is that if we move towards co-determination as a fundamental value in social work, it would help us move away from this fragmentation notion of independence versus the collective, and move more towards indigenous science, history and philosophies.
In a way, you could say that the history of the last 20 years of social work ideas or thinking has been slowly moving towards embracing some of those ideas. So, for example, the Global Agenda for Social Work, which I was very involved with, that came out of the Hong Kong conference in 2020, and this is picking up Nicholas's question about the environment, in a way, to my surprise, identified as one of the 3 pillars of the global agenda, sustainable environment. And we developed that into sustainable environment and sustainable community. And looking back, you go back to social work history in the 19th century, and the sort of individuals who were involved were very often involved in ecological movements. They were called something different in those days, but it was like the National Trust in the UK. And they were interested in housing and the environment of housing, in provision of parks. And it was the people were involved in all of those things, and it wasn't so fragmented. And the global agenda said that we needed to take a holistic view of the human experience. And then moving into the second decade from 2020 onwards, began to look at Ubuntu and making those connections. So the history of ideas is interesting, and how people cross over the ideas itself is really interesting. And whether those ideas in physical science have consciously been translated, or whether it's just because it's in the general discourse, I'm not sure. It would be interesting to look back. But there is certainly a sense in social work of wanting to move towards recognizing the importance of the environment, the physical environment, as well as the social environment, and they come together. But I don't know if that addresses the issue you're picking up, Richard, or whether it's actually more. I mean, you could also go in, I mustn't go on, but you can also look at the critique of the United Nations Convention of Human Rights, which has very much been said to be an individualist statement, and Eastern thinking is much more around collectivist and co-determination principles. And so that is another debate within ethics of social work, which is happening now. And how do you then reframe the words to pick up on that? I don't know if that makes any sense, Richard or other colleagues.
I think the most important thing you said in your statement is that the shift in the transition is slowly making a move. And it slowly is the concern that I've had, is that and this is not just to social work, it applies to all kinds of disciplines. We've known about the quantum science shift away from the old Newtonian science, and that the Newtonian science needs to shrink its domain to allow other trees to grow.
Yeah.
And so why in the North American context, we had somebody tell us in 1915 that we were not a profession because we did not meet that measurement outcome. And it seems that we've been stuck in that criticism. And the answer was, in the American context, was Mary Richmond and social diagnosis. And it sort of trapped us into the idea that we have to become a methodological defined profession and not a systemic, if you want, profession that would go back to what you were saying earlier about those earlier historians. Intuitively, they knew about the interdependence, but they got squished by
but that
the
is another
dominating
interesting
science.
part. That's another interesting part of the history. Is that the profession, or is it the bureaucracies that we work in? And how do you distinguish what the profession wants and what the bureaucracies that employ us are saying that we have to do? And that is another interesting part of the history and the tension to explore.
I mean, Sharon-Rose, you were nodding at that. Would you like to come in and say something?
I was just agreeing with what was being shared, and it reminded me very much of the presentation that was done by Sarita in terms of what took place in the Caribbean as we grew up very much out of what was taking place even in the UK. And those years, you know, it was really, really, truly amazing. And I also support the need for documentation because it's a presentation we had, whereas looking at what was taking place in the African social work and the fact that she went through all those books and then created like a guiding principle, and to be able then to give back also enhances what we do as social workers and in our history. You know, it's a legacy that we push forward, but at the same time being able to know that we have to leave something for those that will come. I think that was quite a mouthful, but I think it was definitely worth it in terms of those efforts that have been made.
Thank you very much indeed. David, you sort of suggest we go back to Charles and that Charles might talk a little bit more about his project.
Okay.
Charles, you were going to say something about the project that you're doing, and I'll just share the screen very quickly as an example of a local project. I hope you're seeing the ideas and the questions, but we haven't got long, Charles, but just very quickly, a way of gathering an oral history. You need to unmute. We can't hear you.
There we are.
Yeah.
Okay, is totally to agree with the speakers who have spoken yesterday, that indeed we need to reflect back and see what we need to bring on board, what we need to document, and what we need to do a study on and to reflect on as we move forward. Within the African countries, there is the issue of the colonial, pre-colonial policies, which obviously were not participatory. The beneficiaries were not did not really participate in these policies, but a section of the beneficiaries, and in this I mean those who are in the civil service, took the responsibility of implementing on behalf of the others. The key issues were to do with health, education, and agriculture, and so on, as a major economic drivers in the new African independent states. Now, the question here is, could it be that some of the social problems we are dealing with, some of the issues that social workers are dealing with, have this background, could arise out of what was not attended at this point? And one of the areas that we ask is we are still, many African countries are still dealing with the problem of food insecurity, health, and even social welfare in terms of the priorities. What went wrong? What can we reflect back and see as need to be attended? Yes, we need to dig up reflect back on the histories and look at even the corporate responsibilities and the systems, social worker systems that came immediately after independence, and that is the dole system and the corporate responsibility, which eventually is also changing. We look at the colonial rules, and could it be that some of the problems, major problems we are dealing with as a result of the history, which was not attended, the separation, segregation, mistreatment, and torture, and the injustices. Could we learn something from this, reflecting back and looking at what we are facing today? There are issues to do with the relationship which rose out of the colonial rule, like the tribal boundaries, the land tenure systems. Currently, many African countries are faced with the problem of tribal parties, political parties, which are a major source of conflict. Are these some of the issues that social work history needs to look at? Is a question. Thank you.
And Charles is working with local organisations to get some oral histories to inform that history, the relationship between practice of social work and the changes in government and the local relationships, which is an important part of the undocumented history of social work. And there may be other examples of that sort of oral history which we can link into. Thanks, Philip. Thanks, Charles.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, David, we're sort of 5 minutes away from our closing time, and we'll have a few thanks to say right at the very end. But I mean, it strikes me that this has been such a rich conference, and with so many really fascinating ideas. But we're committed to taking this forwards in some way. This conference and the workshop before it has established a wonderful global network of scholars and practitioners. But we're now going to have to think collectively about how we frame some kind of funded research project, which will take this to the next step. And I think that some of Charles's comments then about the the way in which suppressed histories that haven't been faced, still create problems for social work. I mean, it struck me that that was a very powerful, you know, when one's taking a research proposal to a funder, one really needs a kind of a strong hook, you know, to be able to sum up the direction of it in 2 or 3 sentences. And I have a kind of feeling that Charles has given us that just then, and that this could be a way forward. You know, the suppressed, the hidden, the forgotten, really painful histories that still have that aren't attended, as Sharon-Rose says, and you know, we should go away, maybe have a think about that, and what we can do as a Commonwealth-wide network, perhaps with funding to dig a little deeper into some of the national cases that we've talked about, produce a really important comparative study. David, I mean, what?
Thank you for those ideas, and we've said that in the discussions in the steering group, and the steering group have been members of the panels today and yesterday, that we're looking to seek some funding, and it would more likely come from the historical social policy side than from the social work side in a way. And obviously we have to frame a study in a way that will attract funding, as you say. But I think we've demonstrated that there's a lot of undocumented and suppressed histories, some of which is painful for social work, because it's about things that social work did wrong in the past. And we have to be honest about that, as we said yesterday. But also some of it is about the strengths of social work, picking up some of the holistic approaches which Richard was touching on, which are there in practice. And as I see Linda's screen just come on there, Linda, that reminds me that we can show that back in the 60s and 70s, people were already discussing these things. So what is it that blocks the progress? And the relationship between the profession and the bureaucracy is another interesting area of study. But I think, Philip, we're expecting that this sort of thing would be a project that would probably involve universities and practitioners in other countries, and that we would want a network of relationships that we built up and can be added to. The difficulty then is who gets included and who isn't, because everybody wants to be included, but we have to work that through, and so we would be interested. Perhaps I could just say there are two or three networks, just very quickly. The Social Work History Network is a network that has already international members, and you can go to the website that's hosted by King's College London, and that's got a communications registration point. The Commonwealth Organisation for Social Work is reviewing our constitution, and at the moment we're not taking new members, but if people are interested in linking in with that, they can contact me or contact, again, we've got a website, I put the link in the chat earlier, and we could link people into that network. And there's the network of information in this network, which Gemma has got, and Gemma said to us that she will tell us when the video is available, which she hopes will be next week. So we've got that record of networks to continue to debate this, and we're interested in hearing people's ideas, Philip.
Yeah, we are indeed. And with that, we've come nicely to 7:15 London time and the end of our conference. And I'd just like to thank all of our speakers for fantastic presentations throughout the last 2 days. And again, to thank David for working so hard to put this program together